My name is Jabulani Jele, and I'm a researcher at the South African Social Policy Research Institute. And I will be giving you an introduction to the Decent Standard of Living Threshold and the Decent Standard of Living Index. So essentially, this presentation will serve the purpose of introducing both of these concepts, as well as outlining the key findings from our research. So by way of an overview, I will go ahead and explain to you how we attempted to quantify in monetary terms what a decent standard of living threshold is, how we updated the decent standard of living threshold amount to 2018 prices using a modification of the CPI, which we refer to as the Decent Standard of Living Index, the possible uses of the study, as well as the possible next steps to take the study further forward. So what is a decent standard of living threshold? In essence, the decent standard of living threshold is a first attempt to try and quantify in monetary terms the resources required for a socially derived decent standard of living. It's an approach that tries to move away from the largely survivalist standard of living that is at the heart of many of South Africa's poverty line measures, like, for instance, the food poverty line, the lower bound poverty line, as well as the upper bound poverty line measures. It is, however, a measure that should be seen, or rather regarded, as complementary to the existing poverty line measures rather than in opposition to them. Overall, it is a threshold that seeks to fill the vacuum of us as South Africans, not having a robust measure of what it is to not merely live to survive, but to live decently. Now, there are three foundations that are underpinning this approach. And these three foundations are 48 focus groups that took place across the country, the 2006 South African Social Attitude Survey module, as well as modules in the 2008-2009, as well as 2014-2015 Living Conditions Survey. Now let's take a look at the first foundation, which was the focus groups. Now, like I said in the previous slide, 48 focus groups took place across the country, and the purpose of these focus groups was to try and ascertain from ordinary South Africans what resources they associated with an acceptable standard of life. So in other words, what types of services, what types of items of possession, as well as activities they regarded or deemed as markers of an acceptable standard of life. Now, the focus groups took place in 7 of the 9 provinces, were conducted in 9 of the 11 official languages, and were made up from participants who were male, female, who lived in urban, rural areas, high income earners, low income earners, and so on and so on. So essentially, the participant profile matched the demographics of South Africa. Now, once all the focus groups were conducted, the findings of the focus groups informed the formulation of the 2006 SASAS module on socially perceived necessities. Now, on that note, let's move on to the second foundation, which is the social attitude survey. So the 2006 module, I attempted to represent the breadth of issues that were raised in the 48 focus groups that took place prior to it. And this was done by a compilation of a 50-item list in which participants were asked to respond to which items from that 50-item list they regarded as essential to have in order to live a decent standard of life. So if I was to break down the list of 50-item questions, 33 questions were about possessions, 4 were about activities, 8 were about the neighborhood in which the people lived, and 5 were about the types of relationships they had with their friends and family. Now, having said that, it is important to note that the module did not try to attempt to address issues of quantity or quality, or who the provider of these necessities is going to be. So the results from the South African Social Attitude Survey from 2006 indicated that 36 of the 50 items that people were questioned on, essentially the people regarded them as essential to have in order to live a decent standard of life. So these were items that over half of the population regarded as essential to have. So 36 items of the 50 were regarded as essential to have in order to live a decent standard of life. These 36 items represent what we refer to as the 36 socially perceived necessities. Now, to take the analysis further forward, we went on and tested the reliability of these 36 item list using the Cronbach coefficient alpha test, and then the score of reliability came back as 0.9201. And now, as a side note, normally when you are doing an analysis using the Cronbach alpha test, any score greater than 0.7% is regarded as reliable using the Cronbach alpha test. So now in our analysis, what we ended up doing was we reduced the number of SPNs from 36, which were regarded as essential by more than 50% of the population, to 21, which were regarded as essential by more than 66% of the population. And now the reason why we did this was in order for us to limit our analysis to SPNs that are applicable to all age groups, and also to raise the threshold of consensus to 2/3, 66%, from a simple 50% majority. So in doing this, we therefore define a decent standard of living as living in a South African household that is in possession of 21 socially perceived necessities. Now, this is the list of the 21 socially perceived necessities. Now, an interesting thing about the list of the 21 socially perceived necessities is their mode of acquisition. What we found was that some of the SPNs are usually acquired through the social wage, others are acquired through social networks, and others are found through commodities, which are essentially paid goods and services. Now, it's important to note that as the 21 SPNs stand as they are, they should be only looked as a set of indicators for an acceptable standard of life, and they by no means represent a comprehensive basket of goods that are required for living a decent standard of life. Now let's move on to the third and final foundation of this approach, which is the living conditions survey. So in 2008, 2009, and subsequently in 2014, 2015, the Living Conditions Survey was the tool used to measure the extent of possession of the 21 of these 21 SPNs at household level. Now, given that the Living Conditions Survey contains both income and expenditure data, it enabled us to explore ways of quantifying in monetary terms what the decent standard of living threshold is. So the first finding that we came across after measuring the extent of possession of the SPNs at household level is illustrated in the graph, in this graph. So from the graph, we can see that only 3% of the population have access to all 21 socially perceived necessities. 3% of the population equates to roughly 1.7 million South Africans. We also found from the graph that 26% of the population have 18 or more socially perceived necessities. 26% of the population equates to about 40 million people, and then finally about 42% of the population have access to more than 16 SPNs, and then 42% of the population equates to about 23 million people. Now, what has to be stressed by us is the fact that although we maintain that a decent standard of living requires the possession of all 21 socially perceived necessities, we acknowledge that progressive realization towards this standard of life is the most appropriate way of framing this in the South African context. Now, a second finding that we came across was in the relationship between median incomes and SPN possessed. The finding essentially says that there is a direct relationship between the number of SPNs possessed and the median monthly income in that household. So essentially, as the number of SPNs increases, the median monthly per capita income in that household also increases. So from the graph, what we found was that a household that is in possession of all 21 SPNs has a median income of close to 6,000 Rand. To be exact, the figure is 5,992 Rand and 88 cents. So this is the decent standard of living threshold using 2015 prices. So the last finding that we came across was in relation to the speed of acquisition of these SPNs. Essentially, what we found was that some SPNs are acquired a lot quicker than others. For instance, as illustrated on the graph, SPNs that are related to commodities, paid goods and services, are usually acquired much later than those that are acquired through social networks or the social wage. So for instance, the table there, you can see that regular service is only acquired at the later end, whereas care when ill and tarred roads are acquired a lot earlier on. Good. So now that I've shared with you how we went about defining what the decent standard of living is, as well as its associated median income, I will now switch to sharing with you how we went about updating the decent standard of living threshold amount to 2018 prices. So the process of updating could have been done by simply using the consumer price index as calculated and received by Stats SA. However, we took the decision to use a modification of the CPI, which we refer to as the Decent Standard of Living Index, or the DSL. Now, the DSL takes into account the proportions of expenditure of those with a decent standard of living threshold, in other words, those who have 21 SPNs, as well as Stats SA subcategory level indices of the CPI. Now, to get the expenditure proportions, we had to first calculate the median expenditure of each expenditure category and divide it by the total median expenditure of that SPN group. The chart, as you see it displayed, indicates the expenditure proportions of households that are in possession of all 21 socially perceived necessities. A general trend that you will see is that the proportion of expenditure that goes toward food and non-alcoholic beverages declines as more SPNs are acquired within the household. This point can be illustrated in this figure right here. A household that has less SPNs in general spends more of the proportion of the expenditure to food and non-alcoholic beverages than a household that has a lot more socially perceived necessities. Right, now for the big news. So after applying the reweighted CPI or the DSL to the decent standard of living threshold amount from 2015 prices, what we found was that the amount associated with a decent standard of living, so in other words, the possession of all 21 socially perceived necessities in 2018, was 7,043 rands per person per month. Subsequently, the amount associated with a household that only has 18 of the 21 SPNs was found to be 2,555, and the amount associated with a 16-person household was found to be 1,466 rands per person per month. So, what does this all mean? I mean, what possible uses can these findings have? So the DSL and the Decent Standard of Living Index can be used as a benchmark for assessing the adequacy of the wages and social security levels in the country, and they can be used as a lens for exploring priorities for public good provision in the country. For instance, they can also be used as a benchmark for of income and earnings in South Africa. For instance, as seen on the table or graph, the Decent Standard of Living threshold amount for 2018 was found to be double that of what the proposed national minimum wage is for the country at 3,500 rand. So what are the next steps to be taken forward with the study? So the first thing is that the report will be made public, and it will also be available on our website www.saspri.org. Just follow the links and then you'll find the report. The Decent Standard of Living amount will be updated on an annual basis using the modification of the CPI as explained, our DSL, and it can also be refreshed on a periodic level, say maybe in a 5-year basis or 10-year basis, where a module in SESA, say, can be put together, or if you want to go deeper than that, further focus groups to find a revised version of what items people regard as essential to have to match the current times. Say, for instance, in 2019 or 2020 going forward, what items do people regard then as items to have in order to live a decent standard of life? So as far as immediate next steps are concerned, a subgroup analysis to profile people who have a decent standard of living versus those who don't will be done by area type, gender, employment, presence of children, social grant eligibility, income, taxpayers, etc. And then we'll continue to monitor progress towards a decent standard of living. Again, it goes back to our talk of progressive realization. And then further than that, we'll keep exploring the policy implications that the study can have going forward. Thank you very much. Thank you. Amen.